All right, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you are all able to join us. This is an event sponsored by the Office of Theology and Worship and the Presbyterian Association of Musicians. It is one in a series of conversations, town hall conversations with contributors to the journal about their articles that they have written for Call to Worship, Liturgy, Music, Preaching, and the Arts. I am Sally Ann McKinsey. I am the editor of the journal, and I am so grateful to be here with all of you and with Claudia Aguilar Rubalcava, who is going to speak with us about her article called Why Baptism Matters for the Work of Dismantling Racism, which was a feature article in the most recent issue titled Baptism. It's vital, I think, to integrate conversations about anti-racism work into our liturgical theology and our sacramental practice conversations as we recognize the ways that racist histories have influenced theology and practice, especially in the white church, and seek reformation and repair together with a spirit of both lament and hope. So as we begin this conversation, I want to note that I come to this conversation as a white woman from South Carolina, and I enter any conversation about anti-racism, recognizing my own privilege in the system and the ways in which I am called to constantly examine and rethink the assumptions that I may bring because of that privilege. And in my work as the editor of Call to Worship, I'm aware that in all these conversations, it's vital for us to make sure that the table includes many diverse voices, that the work of the journal practices what it really means to actively listen to many perspectives and experiences, and especially those of people of color with great intention. So I'm very grateful for Claudia's contributions to the journal over the years, and I cannot wait for this conversation about her article. So I want to introduce Claudia Aguilar Rubalcava. She is the interim pastor at Park Hill Congregational Church in Denver, Colorado. She has been in various forms of ministry for 21 years, most recently serving as the pastor of First Mennonite Church of Denver. Before that, she served as an associate pastor for Justice and Witness at Virginia Highland UCC in Atlanta, and as associate dean of students at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta. She is an ordained minister in the PCUSA. She received an MATS in 2008 and an MDiv in 2011, both from Columbia Theological Seminary. Currently, she is finishing a doctorate degree, and she has worked as a campus minister in Mexico and Chile and holds a BA in international relations. She has led involvement in congregational ministry to the unhoused, undocumented immigrants, and in witness and affirmation of the LGBTQIA+ community. A self-proclaimed liturgy nerd, she has preached at the Montreat Middle School Conference, served on the editorial board of the Book of Common Worship, and is contributor to Presbyterian Outlook, Call to Worship, of course, Unbound, and other publications. She grew up in Mexico City, which she'll tell you a little bit more about. It's her favorite place in the world. And I really appreciate the gifts that Claudia brings to the church as a bilingual, bicultural, and binational minister of word and sacrament. She builds bridges and contributes to these important conversations. And when not working, Claudia is spending her time in her garden, teaching yoga, doing ecumenical and interfaith work, and spending time with her husband, Doug, and dog, hiking with friends. And she also replicates authentic Mexican dishes with limited access to those ingredients. And I would love to hear more about that as well. Claudia, I'm so excited that you're here. Would you, the floor is yours to introduce your article, tell us more about yourself.
Thank you, Sally Ann, and thank you for your introduction and for doing this work. I would just like to start by saying who I am in terms of, because who I am affects my theology. So I was born and raised in Mexico. I grew up in Mexico City, and Mexico is one of the products of colonization. So And the way Christianity developed there is bizarre because it never became the pure Christianity that Europeans wanted to impose. But it turned out its own whole self. So I want to share my screen because I have a really fun PowerPoint here. So this is the Mexico City Cathedral. It's one of the largest cathedrals in the world. And these are Aztec dancers doing cleansings outside of the cathedral. And on Sundays, you can go to Mexico City to Mass, to the cathedral and go to Mass. And then right after, get a cleansing with incense and all these things. And people do it. It's not just like, tourists, like people actually go and do it every Sunday. So that's one of the fun parts about being from Mexico is that we live a faith that has evolved and even against the wills of those who imposed it on us has become ours. So I recognize that that's where I'm coming from and that may not be like, your idea of what Christianity is. So that's one of my biases. And the other one is that I am an immigrant and I am an immigrant with a variety of experiences. I grew up in a very privileged position in Mexico. And the minute I set foot in the States, I became the other. I became a threat and I became almost like trash. It was very strange because I remember my first day in like moving into seminary, I walked to a coffee shop called Java Monkey, and there was a man in front of me. And he ordered his thing, and then I ordered my thing. He's like, "Oh, you have an accent. Where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Mexico." And seriously, his face just like turned red. And then his next question was, "Are you legal?" And back then, I was not in the place where I'm now, where I'm like, that is not an appropriate question and go somewhere else. And I just said, yes, I am. I'm actually studying a master's and I have a student visa. And his face changed again, right? So, and that was my first day by myself in this new city. So that has been my reality since then. And that is like the bias that I'm bringing to this work, because I am affected kind of by racism every single day of my life. So, and then this article, I was asked to write an article on baptism and racism, and that was all the prompts that I got. And one of the things that I love is the little intro sections in the Book of Common Worship for every aspect of our liturgical life. And in reading that, I'm like, well, this could be a good like starting point because this is like our faith, our common faith language for those of us who are Presbyterian. And we can depart from here to talk about racism. So that's how I came up with this like structure. But then I was like, but baptism and the sacraments are more than what we say in the book. So I added a couple other metaphors and images for that. And I think that's all I want to say for now, because I really want to hear questions and all of that. So
thank you. So Claudia and I are going to have a conversation. I have a few questions for you, Claudia, about your article. And then we will open the floor for all of you participants to add questions. So if you would like to, you may add questions either in the chat or in the Q&A section throughout our conversation. And then we'll leave time at the end to engage some of those questions. So feel free to add those. But first I have a question for you, Claudia, about your article that relates to some of what you were sharing about Mexico City and some of those experiences there and dialogues between colonial histories and faith and Christianity. So your article raises a really vital reminder, I think, that baptism has been used and has functioned in the history of the Western Church as a tool of colonialism. And you also discuss the extent to which Christianity changed when it became a state-sponsored and more mainstream religion starting around in the 4th century. So recognizing that a faith that was a faith of disruptors and the oppressed became the religion of the empire in Byzantine Europe, and that we contemporary practitioners are inheriting this faith, and that we need to reckon with this history and the way baptism has functioned within a system of control and conquest. I wonder if you can speak more about how this history informs the way we should be practicing baptism today, as we seek just the opposite, as we seek reconciliation and repair, understanding the role that baptism has played in this history of conquest. And as we seek to follow the Jesus of the Gospels and not the Jesus of the empire or the powers that be. So I would love to just hear more from you about all those dynamics.
Well, so thank you. That is just a very, like, all your questions are always very profound. So I just think it's very profound. So thank you for asking that. I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that baptism and the sacraments and Christianity as a whole have been active instruments in the conquest of many peoples in the world. And really, like, baptism was one of those most important tools of imposing Christianity in the world. When the Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain took over and kicked out the Muslims and Jewish people there, those who decided to remain there were forced to convert. And Catholicism and baptism was that element that you have to be baptized, right? That was the one thing. And so people were stripped away from their identities. That happened with Aztecs, that happened with African slaves, and that happened with all the indigenous peoples in the continent. So if we can use baptism as a tool to create subjects of the empire, we can also use that to do the opposite, like, citizens of the kingdom or liberated people. So I think that today, one of the things we don't do very often is put a lot of care into what goes into baptism. And when we talk with, I've been a pastor for some years, and every time people want to have confirmation or a wedding, people have to go through like premarital counseling, or confirmation is like a whole like semester long. But for baptism, which we claim is a sacrament, we don't require much. And we don't talk about the implications, right? We don't say these things, these metaphors that are important to us, that are in the Book of Common Worship. Like, we don't say, hey, baptism is an incorporation into the body of Christ. Baptism is pardon, cleansing, and renewal. Baptism is the gift of the Holy Spirit. Like, we don't say those things to the parents of the child that we're welcoming. And we definitely don't say that to adults who want to be baptized. So I think making those things clear when we perform a baptism is important. We need to name those things, right? Like, we need to recognize, or whenever we have this like rituals of remembering our baptism, say, hey, we remember our baptism. We remember the liberation of enslaved people through the waters. We remember also that we use this ritual to oppress people. And we remember that God can dismantle all of this and bring water, life through water again. So I think that speaking those words out loud in worship is one of the things we can do to address that historical use of baptism as a tool of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk about also about I love how you use these definitions or these theological meanings of baptism, and talk about the way in which they can really support a rethinking in terms of thinking about baptism as a tool for reconciliation and trying to undo some of that history, but we have to reckon with it as we try to undo it as well. You talk about the major meanings of baptism as entry points into these various conversations between baptism and considerations for the work of dismantling racism. And you do add some to the list, and you talked about that in your introduction. But one of the things you add is baptism as an invitation to a life of chaos, which I love that language. And you give us a beautiful image of members of Mercy Community Church in Atlanta gathering around a makeshift baptismal font and getting as close as possible to that font at the beginning of worship in anticipation that their pastor will be splashing water everywhere, and in this anticipation of like wanting to be part of that. So for me, that also is an image of a way that our practice of baptism can help to speak to release of captives rather than oppressing captives. You also write that following Jesus is about feeding the hungry, releasing the prisoners, and clothing the naked. So it's not a cute or convenient or polite, but a chaotic and irresistible invitation to countercultural living. So can you talk more about the implications here for the work of dismantling racism and this invitation to a life of chaos and what that means to you?
Yes, yeah, another really fascinating question. So again, I'll speak from my experience. When I got baptized, and I shared a little bit in my article, when I got baptized the second time, I got baptized in the Gulf of Mexico, and there had been a tropical storm right before we arrived. So the waters were turbulent, and the waters were full of like fallen trees. Like there were fallen trees like floating around, like, you know, palm trees, but they were floating around the waters, and there were like leaves. It was not the pristine image that we have of baptism and the waters of baptism. So, and I think that was the beginning, right? So like, as I got dunked, which also I'm a terrible swimmer. So I was like really scared. And that is like the beginning of this image for me. Like it was a life of chaos. But then as we read the Bible and like the Gospels and especially Acts, nothing really was according to plan or decently and in order. It was actually really everybody who followed Jesus got in trouble, right? From those who like got healed and told the people, and everybody, the fishermen who left everything to follow Jesus, and the women, like everybody at the end ended up being in trouble with the law, in trouble with the government. And it was, I think we forgot that that's what baptism means. It means getting in trouble for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the good news, and that liberation has come. And I think that, let me just like, when we talk about racism, we are exactly saying like, this work is chaotic. Like if any of you have worked in anti-racism in your church, you know that you're going to get in trouble. Even if you say the word anti-racist in church, you're going to get in trouble. If you say that in institutions of theological education, you're going to get in trouble. If you say, so you're going to get in trouble for doing this work of dismantling racism. And, or even those of you, I see some of you are worship leaders in music. And if you try to incorporate clapping, that is not at the beat that people are used to clapping, music that is like, you know, from Africa and Latin America and Asia, you will get in trouble. People will be, especially like I see that more with Asian and Native American music, where people are like, well, that's not kind of like our rhythm. Like that's not kind of what we do. That's not the tempo we use. That's not the metric we use. And people get in trouble for doing that. And that's the invitation that we have. And those are the ways in which we can address these things. Like we don't have to say, let's be anti-racist in worship today. Like let's just sing a song, right, from another part of the world. And you're going to get in trouble. Like this is not going to get easy. And that is not the promise. Like I don't think Jesus ever said, follow me, it's going to be easy. And Jesus said, follow me, bear your cross. So it's very challenging, but it is compelling, and it is, you said the word irresistible. And I think that is exactly the word. I'm sorry for using all these Frozen references, but I have a teenage niece and a baby nephew. And, you know, in Frozen 2, there's this voice that calls Elsa like, ah. Okay, that voice, like that's kind of like the call, that, right? And she is like, I hate it. Like it's here stuck in my ear, but it's calling me and it's taking me there. And I think that that's the call, right? Like that is the work that we're called to do. It's hideous. It's following us everywhere. And we try to mute it, and yet it's there. And we are slowly but surely getting there.
It's interesting to me, the balance between thinking about preparation for baptism, as you spoke about just a few minutes ago, and the idea of practicing baptism and practicing even worship and liturgy in a way that we expect for things to not go according to plan. So like, I think that there is a really important call to think about how we prepare the baptized or the family of the baptized in terms of talking about these meanings and how these meanings influence our everyday actions in dismantling racism, but also like being, you know, called to the irresistible work of not being polite about our faith. So thank you so much. So I have one more question for you, and then we have a lot of questions happening in the chat, I believe. So everyone, if you have a question, I hope we can get to it. Please put those into the chat or the Q&A. You write in your article that resurrection is a muscle. In the work of dismantling racism, I'm wondering if you can talk more about this idea of resurrection being a muscle. And it's something that, you know, you talk about the ways that the early church practiced their life together. And I think that it sounds like in your article, you give us a lot of reasons why the early church practiced resurrection as a muscle and some of the ways they did that. And how do you see this happening in the contemporary church or not? And what would you call us to in terms of our practice to practice resurrection as a muscle?
So the end of Wendell Berry's poem, The Mad Farmer's Manifesto, is practice resurrection. And the whole poem, which I highly recommend, is basically saying like, this is the way farming has been done, and you should go the other way. And that is basically it. And Dr. Anna Carr Florence from Columbia Seminary would make students use this poem as like the beginning of a poem they would call the Mad Pastors or Mad Preachers Manifesto. So what would it mean to be like, to go the other way? The whole practice resurrection is not my idea. It's Wendell Berry's and probably other people's. But it is this call to be countercultural, right? From going to monocrops to going back to heirloom tomatoes, and from doing like one variety of corn to going back to the 380 varieties of corn there are in the world. Being anti-racist, dismantling racism is the way others didn't go, right? Like, this is why we are where we are today, because we went on this path for so long. So we are called to be mad farmers. We are called to be mad Christians. We are supposed to do the thing that makes no sense. Like, that's the foolishness of the gospel. We are called to do this thing that really makes no sense, because really for someone like you, Sally Ann, and some of the people here in the chat, it makes no sense, because that means giving up your privilege, right? Like, it means that you have to give up some power, and that is not comfortable. It's not even natural. It's like that's not how we're built to do things. Like, we are built to care for ourselves and those who are part of our group, and we're tribal, right? So going for the other groups is not in our DNA. So that's what I mean with practice resurrection. Like, right, if doing the other thing is so counterintuitive that you have to practice it. And it will sound like very silly, but working out is one of those things that I just despise. And for like practice resurrection, it's in terms of anti-racist work, is like me working out, right? Like, it's something you don't like doing, something that doesn't feel great when you're doing it. And yet it's the only way to get to a result, whether it's like lower your cholesterol or whatever. So that's what I mean with it. It is a muscle. It is something we need to practice, because it is not intuitive. It does not come with the package of being human. And I see it. So, and you may not think of me as a lighter skinned person, but in terms of Latin American skin colors, I am considered a lighter skinned person. And, I can pass as white if I shut up. And the muscle is avoiding that temptation for me. That's the muscle I need to practice, right? That's practicing resurrection. It is speaking up when the darker skin Latin American people are being mistreated or given things that are being treated in a way that I am not being treated. So it is a muscle that, again, it means giving away something, whether it's comfort or privilege or power, or even money, right? Some people should be getting scholarships, not us. And it just takes everyday work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thinking of resurrection as a practice in that way, and thinking of anti-racism as a practice is something that you have to have constant attention on. And, that's where my privilege, for example, means that I could just exist without intent. If I exist without intention, then I'm living within a system that's a racist system. So a practice is something that you continue to, no matter how long you've been practicing it, it's a constant action, and anti-racism work is that way, but also liturgy is that way too. And presiding is that way. And Christianity is that way, in the sense of thinking about what it means to be a disciple of the Jesus of the Gospels. So yeah, I think thinking about practice is really appropriate in this. And so continuing to be active in our listening and active in our actions. Baptism is also, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say baptism too, right? And that's
right.
why it's important to like say the words out loud when we do these things, when we have a baptism, when we remember our baptism. It's important to say, these are the waters that oppressed people. These are the waters that liberated people. These are the waters that will transform. Like, just, it is a practice, like something we just do every Sunday, which is why I'm a huge advocate for the sacrament, which is another conversation, but the sacraments in every worship, like either remembrance of our baptism and communion for every Sunday, not just once a month, because then, if you don't practice the thing every week, like, it's amazing how fast we lose fitness or, condition to do. Like, if I were to run once a month, that's never going to take me anywhere. I need to like run every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's part of becomes a vocation and an identity. Baptism is also a taking on of an identity or a vocation. And so that's a way that we think about practice as lifelong and constant. And so, yeah, thank you for that invitation and challenge and charge to us. I know that we have a lot of questions happening in the chat, so I thought maybe we'd turn to some of those, if that's okay with you, Claudia. Yeah. The first one I see is, has the Presbyterian Church ever denounced and lamented the doctrine of discovery? It seems to me that this is very important to repentance and repair. Would you want to respond to that, Claudia?
No idea. Like, I want to respond by saying, I have no idea if we have. What I do have an idea about is that if we have not talked about it or advertised it. And if we haven't, then there's more work to do. But acknowledgement is like super important, but it's only one step. So, if you're going to lament the doctrine of discovery while like complaining about the smell of that your African immigrant church leaves in the kitchen, then to me, that is just like dissonance, right? So Presbyterians have been historically amazing at putting beautiful words together. We're terrible at putting them in action. So more than having a denunciation of the doctrine of discovery, I would love to see like more active anti-racism in our liturgy, in our hiring, and all of these things. Like, if you go to like GA, like, the staff at GA is like, it looks like the kingdom of God. People from all over, all colors, all shades, all gender identities, all like sexual orientations. But that is like what we use for the picture. Like, I want to see the change in what we don't see in the picture, which is like our congregations that have like, a session of like 9 men and 1 woman. Like, that is like where the work is. So the denunciation would be great, but if it is, that's not the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that the Office of Theology and Worship is in conversation about this often, but I agree, Claudia. It's the type of thing that it's we're interested in what's happening, in churches with our collective practice, as well as what's happening in larger scale conversations, so it's a holistic effort. Thank you. So my next chat item is from Melissa McNair King. Hello, Melissa. Hi, loved your article thinking about baptism as an invitation to a life of chaos. I once had a colleague who refused to ask the question, do you turn from the ways of sin and renounce evil and its power in the world? he thought it was too Catholic. That is a somewhat extreme example, but I do think it points to our preference to see baptism as a warm and fuzzy event rather than that invitation into holy chaos and disruptive joy. What advice would you give to worship leaders to help balance the holy grace and holy challenge that comes with baptism?
Well, that question has so many things that we can unpack. Well, I grew up half Roman Catholic, half Baptist. So the Roman Catholic faith has like a very special place in my heart. And I just cannot believe that people are still using Catholicism as a scapegoat for things that they don't want to do. Like we don't want to have communion every week because that's too Catholic. We don't like everything that we don't like, it's too Catholic. But the truth is that question, and I am the least qualified person to talk about our confessions, but that question is in all of the catechisms in the confessions. So it is very Reformed and it's very Protestant to ask that question. And I think our beloved Calvin would be very upset by that claim that it's too Catholic to ask that question. But in terms of what advice would you give worship leaders to help balance the holy grace and holy challenge? I think part of it is having greater conversations about the meaning of our sacraments in confirmation classes, in adult education classes, in worship. But also, what I love, the whole thing that happened at Mercy Church is just too beautiful, like to let go. So in the article, I describe it, that they had this like giant, clear-ish, because it was too beat up, salad bowl that they would fill with water and they would put on top of a bucket. And Pastor Maggie would just like come and like say, remember your baptism. And the way she would talk about the water before she splashed everyone was so meaningful, because she's like, this is the water. And she never used these like fancy theological terms. She was like, this is the water with which we make our coffee every morning. This is the water that we use to clean our bodies in the bathroom. This is the water, right? She was saying like, this water is the same water that we use for all these everyday things. And in that way, she was incorporating the holy grace and the challenge, right? Like she was saying like, right, not having access to the water to make coffee is this challenge, it's a holy challenge. But then she was like, but this is the water of joy too, right? And she would just like, then go ahead and just like splash everyone. And it got to ridiculous points where like people started wearing ponchos to like get in the front row and like sit and get splashed. But they wanted to get splashed, which is like right? If we were in our traditional churches, people would probably move farther away. But in this church, people wanted that chaos. People wanted to get wet. People wanted to like participate in that. So I think remembering that water holds that tension. I think water was a great metaphor in general. I think a great choice from our ancestors to use, because water is destructive and water is life-giving. So I think it's perfect to talk about how it's holy grace and holy challenge at the same time. It's these two things we hold together, and to remind people that it is all of those things in tension. And so the end of, I don't think I mentioned that in the article, but what I loved about this whole thing at Mercy Church was that, oh, and by the way, Pastor Maggie is also a Presbyterian pastor, is that at the end of it, there was this man who could not deal with the chaos of the water all over. And he would just come and in the middle of worship, would just like mop the floor. It's like, and really that's us, right? Like we have this like holy chaos, that invitation to live in this messy work, and we're just there with our little mop, and kind of destroying the beauty of it. So, and I miss you too, Melissa.
That's really beautiful. And it occurs to me that these are aesthetic concerns too. You know, we think about the material and the visual in worship. This is all implicated. All the materials are implicated in the things that are our actions, in the sense that, and you talked about your baptism in the Gulf of Mexico. That's an aesthetic experience as well. And for it to be what some may classify as quote unquote messy, is just a wonderful aesthetic reflection on the theology or the concepts that we want to communicate about baptism. So it occurs to me too that this is also about liturgical art, in the sense that bowl, that used bowl, was the appropriate vessel for baptism. And that thinking about the water being ordinary is the appropriate language as well.
Well, and like, I mean, you are the expert in aesthetics and arts, but that's exactly right? Like you see, like I've seen how like baptismal bowls have like shrunk, like, and seriously, like the church where I'm currently serving, the baptismal bowl is like this big. And it's like, what are we doing with this grace, right? We're talking about abundant grace in a tiny bowl. So like, why don't we like go and like use this giant, like, you know, like there's, again, and that goes a lot into worship planners, right? Like what aesthetics are you looking? I worked in a church in Atlanta that had this thing that they borrowed from the UUs called Water Communion Sunday. And what they did is that during the summer, when everybody traveled, they asked people to fill a vial of water that they would give everyone a vial, and they would get it with water from wherever they were traveling. And at the end of the summer, they would just get together and everybody would pour this water in this shell. They got it in a Michael's or in like, you know, a Hobby Lobby, like one of those like stores, but it's like a giant shell. And everybody would pour these waters from all over the world. Like we had waters from Australia and Appalachia. Like it was just beautiful. And we would use that water for all the baptisms, for all the blessings of houses and cars and schools and classrooms. Like we would use them for all sorts of things. Funny thing, it was gross. Like these were also gross waters. Like they were gross and chaotic and full of bacteria. We boiled them like 3 times and they were still like yellow. So we just dealt with the fact that it was yellow water and we just told people don't drink it. But yeah, the aesthetics of it, right? Like who thought of that giant shell, which is the symbol of the pilgrims, right? That's beautiful.
Yellow water is too.
Yeah, yellow water too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just a small aside related to this, Lisa Dayhill wrote an article for the baptism issue as well that deals with some of these issues of local waters. Really interesting read. So anti-racism work runs throughout our theology, practice, and aesthetics and materials of baptism. And I do think that Melissa noted that she did disagree with that colleague, but I do think that the renunciation of sin and evil too is really, it's important for us to note that that's a really vital piece of anti-racism work, and that's really a vital piece of baptism practice as well. So.
Well, and I would add, it's a big piece in evangelism too. So the Methodists, like I wrote down the Methodist renunciation vows that are in their baptisms. And they have a t-shirt and that you can just purchase that has these things like that says like dismantling oppression and injustice where in whatever form it takes. And I bought that t-shirt because I saw it somewhere else. And I bought that t-shirt and I wear it, it's just like a regular t-shirt. So I just wear it on hikes and stuff like that. And there's not been a day that people don't say, I like what that t-shirt says. And there's not been a day where people don't get shocked when I say, these are my baptismal vows. Mm-hmm. And right, like in an era where people are complaining about why people are not coming to church, because we're not living out these. Like we're not even speaking them out loud. We're shoving them down. So like amplify them, like put those in like your banner instead of all are welcome and lying about it. Yeah. Just put that, right? Just say like renouncing evil and injustice in whatever form it takes.
Yes, because that is an affirmation, like even more so than all are welcome, perhaps. So yes, thank you. That's also part of your article. That's a really important. We have a few Q&A questions to get to. Brian Tanaka says, what responses have you gotten so far from the article, individual or systemic?
To be honest, I have only heard from Cillian.
Well,
and what I heard is like that systemically, like they're going to feature it in the new website for call to worship. Is that correct?
Yes, we're working on a new website for call to worship where we will have archives and current issues for subscribers, but we'll also have some articles for everyone. And this is going to be one of those ones that we offer. Brian has one more comment that might be helpful. Say more on the idea about people with dominant identities being unwilling to embrace these values because they don't want to experience the discomfort of acknowledging and giving up their Christian privilege. How do we welcome more people into the communal conversation?
Yeah, well, that is kind of the tension in which we live. And I mean, that is like the tension in which I live. I have primarily served white congregations as a non-white person. And I think that it all comes down to eating with, it will sound so cheesy. And there's other ways, right? Like, but what I found is that telling people, give up your white privilege is not going to take us anywhere, even though that's what we need to do. I think it's a long process of eating with people. I have heard, not here in Denver, because everybody thinks they know Mexican food, but in Georgia, I fed so many people because they had so many prejudices against Mexican food. And then if you can debunk that myth, and then they go to your house and they're like, oh, you don't live like the way I thought Mexicans lived. And like, you start debunking, like there's no other way than opening your home. And really, that's the whole goal of Christianity is not what happens in church, it's what happens at home. It's what happens at your table. Like we do the big table at church so that you can open the table at home. But we can also reverse the process and start at home, right? Like how many people of color or from diverse cultures or from LGBTQI community have you invited to your home this week or this month or this year? And invite them over and just like have dinner. And probably that's going to be easier to swallow when people want to be part of session or, lead worship. And I do think that it is transformative to share a meal with people. And I actually wrote something like that around this down. So at Mercy, again, Mercy is like a cool place. If you're ever in Atlanta, go to Mercy Community Church. At Mercy, we would have all these, because it was a church that primarily served people experiencing homelessness, we had a lot of mission groups going. And obviously all the mission groups wanted to clean something, build something, paint something, or cook food. And the policy in Mercy was that if you were there for a whole week, Like you would not do that until your very last day. And what you did all the other days was just to sit down and eat with people. Like that's all you did in your mission trip. And then people were like mortified because there was this man who had not showered in a week, making food and serving food to them instead of them with their pristine little hands and manicures to like serving the food to the people, right? It flipped the roles. And in doing so, it changed minds. Like there were people who came out of that and mercy, like experience at mercy of those mission trips that were transformed to the point that they became social workers. I mean, Pastor Maggie became a social worker. Like at the end, right? It was transformative to that point. Like it transforms people's calls. So flip the tables, like flip the roles in the table. Who serves and who is served.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in your article, you also talk about some of these themes and how they worked in the early church too. It just reminds me that practicing hospitality in your home is a basis for early church liturgy, really. And that part of what you say in your article too is about learning one another's languages. And I wonder about that as also an anti-racism practice. Anti-racism work is to learn new languages in both the literal sense and also thinking about every relationship as a process of learning. Yeah, that's what came to mind.
Yeah, well, Pastor Maggie's last name is Leonard when she was not married, but now she's married and her last name is different and I cannot remember. But yeah, like that was like the whole beginning of the church was like in houses. Like that is like, and the whole purpose of gathering and eating was not to do communion as like a ritual. It was so people would be fed. Right. There are some passages in the epistles and in Acts where it says, you know, people were fed, like people were like, and no one should have communion if someone is going home hungry. So.
Yeah, where the next issue of Call to Worship is going to be around Eucharist. So get excited for these conversations to come back up. Paul Galbraith writes an article about Eucharist and the world's hunger, thinking about that and thinking about the relationship between our ritual action and physical eating and being fed. So yeah, again, material concerns, aesthetic concerns. Are there any other questions? I believe I have asked all the ones that are there, but please speak up if you had a question that did not get asked. Claudia, do you have any final thoughts or anything final that you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, sorry, the phone was ringing. So yeah, I think that we don't have to, when people think about dismantling racism, we think about the whole, like, you know, how do we change this history of this country that is so like big and beyond ourselves? And that gets very overwhelming when the truth is that the work is in our own congregations and our own presbyteries, in our everyday practices. And I think that's why I love that Call to Worship is addressing what we do in liturgy. Like, right, this is the work of the people. This is our work. And this is the work that we are called to do. And I think that remembering that the work starts at home is like essential. And really, Maria Harris wrote in her book, Fashion Mia People, that everything we do is curriculum, is teaching us something by what we do or what we don't do. And basically everything we do, like seriously, walk through with the eyes of a stranger through your worship and see what you're teaching. Like everything is either building up systems of oppression or dismantling them. Are we putting inclusive language? Are we putting icons that help neurodiverse people in our bulletins? Are we like, you know, where do we put the ushers? What kind of art do we have in the church? All of these things are teaching people something. And if we just put out a confession, another confession, and I know that another confession is probably in the works, what is the purpose of having another confession when we go back to like the stained glass of white Jesus, right? Which is probably a little harder to change than like our communion set or our baptismal font. But it doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be like fancy. It's like the small things that really make a difference. Like the example is this, like we had one Chinese guy who came to our church in Atlanta, and he spoke zero English. And I have no idea why this man decided to come and worship with us for that summer. But at the very end, we were able to get a translator to talk with him. And he said that he kept coming back because we had these little icons for neurodiverse people that indicated what we were doing in worship. And he's like, I know this order of worship, and I can follow it even if I don't understand anything of what is happening. So you just never know when you are entertaining angels with the things you're doing and how you are dismantling systems of oppression. Like this man felt unwelcomed everywhere in Atlanta for a whole summer. He was visiting a child, except for this place that had little icons. So just remember that everything is curriculum, like everything is building up systems or dismantling them. So just be mindful of what you're building up and dismantling.
Thank you. You are such a gift to the church and to the journal. I'm very, very grateful for this conversation. Thank you all for being here. I have a few announcements as we wrap up. The Office of Theology, Formation, and Evangelism is hosting 3 conversations on anti-racism and reconciliation as a spiritual practice this fall. So if you want to continue this conversation, of course, there are many ways to do so. One of them is to attend these conversations that are being hosted. These are facilitated by panelists that will be diverse, and will kick off with Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Taylor. Carlton Johnson is going to be presenting on September 15th at noon Eastern. Shanae Leonard is presenting September 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And Alonzo Johnson is presenting October 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern. There will be a flyer if you want to keep in touch. On the website of the Office of Theology, Formation, and Evangelism, there will be a flyer that will come out with a Zoom link for those conversations, but those will be webinar conversations similar to this one. Also, please note that the 2023 Music and Worship Conference webpage is up, and you can find it at presbymusic.org/2023 conference. If you want to find information for the 2023 Worship and Music Conference that will be held at Montreat this coming summer. And the next town hall conversation of this kind will be held October 6th at 1 Eastern with David Bjorlin and Philip Morgan about singing around the font. David Bjorlin wrote a wonderful article about congregational song and baptism, and Philip Morgan will be in conversation with him about that. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. And as we go, thank you, Claudia, for your charge to us to practice resurrection as a muscle and to practice dismantling racism in all our daily curriculum. So thank you. We'll hope to see you at the next town hall.
Yeah. See y'all.